Guys, welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to be continuing on with our SwiftUI tutorial series, and in this particular tutorial we are going to be taking a look at how we can use NSViewRepresentable to wrap an AppKit view into a SwiftUI view. This is particularly useful if you need to use an AppKit control or you have a custom AppKit control that SwiftUI does not have an equivalent for, or does not have an easy way to implement that control, or an existing control isn't quite as performant as you need it to be, so you might have to reach down to AppKit for a more performant view. All those things are very valid reasons to use NSViewRepresentable to wrap an AppKit view into a SwiftUI view. So, how can we do this for ourselves? Well, we are going to create a circular slider struct, circular slider view that SwiftUI doesn't have an equivalent for, right? It only has the horizontal sliders, and you could use rotation effect to rotate it to make a vertical slider, and that works fine. But there's no circular slider to be had. There's no slider that acts like a knob, right? So that is where NSViewRepresentable can come into play. Now, let's go into Xcode and create a new file. We'll create a new file. I'm going to say Swift file. And we're going to call this file circular slider. Now, if you are familiar with the package that I have released called NS Alchemy, you'll know that package has a circular slider view inside of it. And it's very customizable. However, this view that we're going to work on in this video is not the same thing. It's not the same view. It's not going to be as customizable. It's going to be a very small example of how we can use NSViewRepresentable. By the way, the URL for the Git repo can be found in the description if you want to check that out. But that's besides the point. So, now that we have a Swift file called circular slider, what we're going to do is, instead of importing Foundation, we're going to import SwiftUI. Then we're going to create a struct called circular We're going to have this conform to NSViewRepresentable. And then inside of this structure, we're going to need a couple things. First, we're going to need a binding to the value of our slider. So we'll say at binding var value. And this will be a double. We're also going to need a label. So we'll say var label string. Then we're going to need a minimum and a maximum value. So var min value equals 0, or min value double var max value double. You could also make that a range if you wanted to. That works either, that works all the same. And then we are going to have after our minimum and maximum values, we can have a step value. So var step, and that can be a double as well. Now we'll create an initializer. So init underscore label string. We'll have a value that's going to be a binding with a double. We're going to have a min value and a max value of type double as well. And then we'll have a step double, and that will have a default value of 1. All right. Now we'll say self.label equals label, self.value or underscore value equals value, self.min value equals min value, self.max value equals max value, self.step equals step. You could also give the minimum and maximum values default values. We're not going to do that here, but you could if you really wanted to. All right. Now that we have our initializer, excuse me, I'm not feeling all that great today. We are going to start implementing the methods required by NSViewRepresentable. The first among them is make NSView. Now, this method is the method where we are going to create and configure the AppKit view object, configure that object, and return it. So our SwiftUI view that is wrapping this NSView or NSControl, whatever subclass, knows what it needs to render, what it needs to use for its view, right? So we'll say make NSView, and then you'll see that this is returning some NSView. Well, while that works, we want this to be a little bit more specific. So instead of some NSView, we will have this return an NS slider. Now, we create a circular slider in AppKit with an NS slider instance. The NS slider is much more customizable than the SwiftUI slider. So just keep that in mind. My package does expose a lot of that customizability. So if you want a pre-done solution, you can check out that package. But in this method here, getting back to the meat and potatoes, we are going to say var slider equals NS slider, give it an empty initializer, and then here we can finally begin configuring our slider. First, we're going to set the accessibility label of our slider, and that will be using our label that we passed into our initializer. So we'll say slider.set accessibility label, and then we'll pass it label like that. Perfect. Now we have our accessibility label. Let's set the value of our slider. And to do that, we need to access the double value of our slider. Now, the double value property is a double, as the name implies, and this is the currently selected value of the slider. So this can be set and can be retrieved. All right, we'll say slider dot double value equals value, like that. Perfect. Then we'll set the minimum and maximum values. And that can be done by saying slider dot, and we want min value equals min value. Slider dot max value equals max value. And then slider dot step. Slider dot, and then you can see all the other properties of NSSlider here, where we can set number of tick marks, whether or not we want them, stuff like that. We want, let's see, where is it here? Okay, we want alt increment value. And we'll set that to step. And then finally, we are going to say slider dot slider type. We're going to set that equal to, and you can see we have circular, linear, and that's it. We want circular, like that. And with that, we can return slider. Now, we're not quite done with this method yet, but this is the basic stuff that we need to get this method mostly working. And the reason why we're not quite done is because we need to be able to have some way to update the state of not only the binding, but also to update the value, like the double value of the slider when that state changes. All right. So the next thing that we're going to need is we're going to need a coordinator. Now, to return a coordinator to our NSViewRepresentable, we use the makeCoordinator method. Alright. And then instead of returning void here, we will return a coordinator instance. And we haven't created this class yet, but all we need to do inside of this method is return coordinator. And we'll pass it self, because we're going to need an instance of the current view to be able to access the binding to our value. Now, okay, let's back up just slightly. What is a coordinator? Well, in NSViewRepresentable, NSViewControllerRepresentable, all that stuff, a coordinator is designed to act as a delegate for your view. Now, this requires that you have some knowledge of how AppKit and UIKit and all that stuff work under the hood, but I'll kind of give you a little bit of a crash course. So in AppKit, we rely on the target action design pattern and delegation. Now, what is target action? Well, target action is a way for us to specify actions that a specific target should execute. Now, the target is some kind of object that conforms or that inherits from, in AppKit's case, NSResponder. And then the action in Swift is going to be what's known as a selector. Now, a selector is how Objective-C can communicate with Swift to know what action needs to be performed when some event gets triggered, whether that be a button click or a slider value change or the selection of a segmented control changing, stuff like that. So that is fundamental to AppKit. Now, delegation is a design pattern where you can kind of think of it as a boss-intern analogy, where the view is the boss, and the delegate is the intern. The boss tells the delegate what it needs to do, but it doesn't care how it's done. The intern has all the implementation details of those delegate methods and performs those tasks when called upon. So the boss doesn't have to care. And that's sort of how delegation works. The boss, or the view or view controller, is delegating tasks to another object. And those are the two fundamental concepts that you need to understand to make coordinators work in this context. All right, so let's go to the top of our view here. And then before our properties, we are going to have a class. Yes, this has to be a class. It'll be called coordinator. We want this coordinator, in this case, not all the time, but in this case, because we want an action method to be executed, we need to inherit from NSResponder. And since we don't have a delegate, that's all we need, right? We don't have any delegate protocols to conform to for a slider. But if you did, for example, need a view that had a table view or a collection view, you would have a delegate to conform to here. All right. So inside of this coordinator, we need a property called parent. Now this parent is going to be of the same type as our view. And again, we need this parent because we need to access the value binding. So we'll say var parent. We'll make that of type circular slider. Then we need an initializer with underscore parent and make that of type circular slider as well. And then inside the initializer, initialize parent like that. Perfect. Now the last thing that we need is a value changed action method. And this is what we're going to use to update our state. So to update the state, first we'll say at objc. This annotation allows our method to, or allows our object to communicate with Objective-C and tell it, hey, this is the action method you need to execute for the selector that references this method. Func, we'll call it value changed. We'll give it a sender. Underscore sender of NS slider. And then inside of this method, we will simply say parent dot value equals sender dot double value, like that. And that is our coordinator. Other than one small thing, we need a required initializer here. And the reason why is because AppKit just requires that we have this for storyboard purposes, but of course we're not working with storyboards. It's just required by AppKit, so you don't need to worry about it too much. Just do required init. It's an optional initializer. Pass it an NSCoder, like that. And then we'll just cause a fatal error with the message of not supported if this initializer, for whatever reason, gets called upon. All right. Now, let's go back to make NSView. So So we'll go back down here. And then after we declare the slider type, we want slider.target. We're going to set that equal to context.coordinator. So the coordinator, the coordinator property of our context is referring to our coordinator class that we made up above. So that coordinator is going to be the object that will run the selector that we're going to specify here. All right. Now, we need an action. So we'll say slider.action equals hashtag selector. And then in the parentheses of hashtag selector, we need to pass in a reference, not a call, but a reference to the method that needs to be executed. And that is going to be in context.coordinator.valueChanged, like that. All right. And with that, we can add one last method to our view, and that is update UI view. This is another method that is required to conform to NSViewRepresentable. And all we're going to do in here is update the double value of our slider. Excuse me. And in this method, you should not, under any circumstances, update the state of your view itself. That will cause unexpected behavior, and Xcode will warn you as much. This method, as the name implies, is only for updating the UI view or NSView itself. All right, so update NSView. And then here we will simply say NSView dot double value equals value, just like that. And we are good to go. That is our circular slider completed. Let's go ahead now and go back to content view and test this out. So content view. All right, so let's go ahead and say at state private var value, we'll make it a double, equals 0.5, let's say 0.5. Or actually, to make it a little bit simpler, let's say 50. So it'll be 50. We'll have a VStack. Or actually, let's make this an HStack. Why not? HStack with some spacing of 10. All right. And then inside of the HStack, we'll have some text of, for example, we'll say value and then we'll say DB, I believe it. I'm not entirely sure how the abbreviation is exactly punctuated, like, or I don't know how the capitalization of decibels is. I think it's lowercase d, uppercase B. Please correct me if I'm wrong, audiophiles. I don't know. I'm not an audiophile here. All right, after our text view, we will say circular slider. And we want to give it a label of, we'll say volume. And then the value will be bound to value. And then the minimum value will be 0. The max value will be 100. And that's it. We'll have the step, I guess, as well be 1. You could set it to whatever, but we're going to say 1 here. Like that. Let's go ahead and save our code and run it. We have a build failure, it looks like. So we'll take a look at what that looks like here. Okay, so it looks like need to call the super.init like that. And let's run this now. Okay, so just remember in the initializer of the coordinator, call super.init so everything works after we initialize the parent. And so here we are in our application. We can see 50.0 decibels, which is exactly what we want. Here's our circular slider. I'm going to adjust this. Let's go all the way up. Let's say 75%. And you can see the value updated as well, exactly how we intended it to. So with that, that pretty much does it for how we can wrap an NSView subclass in an NSViewRepresentable to display it in SwiftUI. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.